Hey guys, Raven of Ash here. After the parry guide, I thought about making another guide for more inexperienced invaders. Dark Souls 3 has over 100 weapons, and picking your weapon loadout for invasions can be a daunting task. The idea for this video is to give an overview of each of the weapon classes in Dark Souls 3 and highlight some of the weapons from each class for invading, explaining what are the builds, combos or strategies I have used with them. Like in the invasion parry guide, I wanted to make this in a single video for accessibility purposes. Check the description to jump for any part of this video. Also, I wanted to do an introductory guide to Poise and how to harness its power in invasions. This is why this guide is divided into 4 parts: the non-Hyperarmor weapons, the Poise chapter, the Hyperarmor weapons, and finally the auxiliary weapons. Feel free to comment down below about what weapons, combos or playstyles you had the most success with in invasions. As with the parry guide, corrections to this guide that you guys write up in the comments will be added in the description. Also, I will reference YouTube content creators through the guide, for those looking for Dark Souls videos. The community in this game is amazing, and the effort made by these people is outstanding. They have helped me immensely through my Dark Souls 3 journey, and it's more than fair for them to be referenced in this guide. For starters, I would like to mention a YouTube content creator by the name of The Game Economist that has reviewed a lot of the weapons shown in this video, linked to his channel in the description. I have also used a Poise calculator posted on Reddit by the legendary P and a true combo list posted on Reddit by Hey I'm Nico. Links for these Reddit pages in the description. Daggers are defined by their very high attack speed and low weight, and most of them have low stat requirements, and so they can be used as an alternate weapon in almost any build. Most of them also have the quick step weapon art and a big critical multiplier that is useful for tanking criticals such as riposts or backstabs. If properly spec'd for it, a Chaos Dagger Hornet Ring riposte will one-shot most if not all phantoms and a lot of hosts at meta level. Daggers excel in 1v1 combat against slow weapons and great shields, while being weak against multiple opponents due to their almost inexistent range. They are also good for applying status effects such as bleed or poison, as it is easy to hit your opponent a lot of times with a dagger. Sometimes I use daggers against great shields, as PvE players often over-rely on them to avoid all the damage. If a dagger user spams R1 against a shield, the opposing player can only block or roll out, as you will interrupt your opponent's swing during their startup frames. As no great shield can parry, this is a safe way of getting through great shields if not particularly fast. Daggers are also useful when you swing from the back foot against aggressive opponents that want to stay in your face. A few swings from a dagger will make them roll out and ease the pressure. Beware that while the quick step weapon art is really useful for avoiding damage against slow weapons, it performs poorly against weapons with a wide swing arc and high speed, such as straight swords, curved swords and even one-handed greatswords. Also, its weapon art is very useful for areas where you cannot run or normal roll, such as the Faron Swamp or the sludge areas in the Cathedral of the Deep, even if you don't have FP. However, if your opponent is backtracking or running away, you will have trouble in causing significant damage, so they are very weak chase down weapons. The ones I most commonly use are the regular dagger for its high critical damage multiplier and quick step weapon art, and the bleed infused banded knife for easy bleeding, as well as having the quick step weapon art. One word about 3 other weapons. The Corvian Great Knife. By far the longest dagger, which is its main strength. I don't particularly like the Corvian Great Knife for invasions, as its critical multiplier is much lower than the regular dagger and its weapon art is too situational for me. The Aquamarine Dagger. I really like this weapon, but the fact that it scales with dexterity as well as intellect, added to the fact that it relies on focus points to be useful, really limits its flexibility. The Scholar's Candlestick. Not used by most as a weapon, its utility lies in the fact that if used on one hand, it will grant a boost of 12.5% to sorcery damage, even if you do not meet the requirements for equipping this weapon. The Fist and Claws class has 6 weapons. Their distinctive traits are their high attack speed, lack of range, and somewhat useful weapon arts. They are almost always used as support weapons and/or parrying tools. Note however that the Fist and Claws class has been nerfed on April, and whiffing parries with this weapon class comes at a higher price, as you take damage when you whiffing a parry. However, since the patch of the 23rd of March 2017, half of the weapons in this class became close to irrelevant. This is because that was the patch where From Software nerfed Cartus Rouge, and half of these weapons heavily depended on bleed to do more damage. Since then, it's very uncommon to see the weapons of this class that have innate bleed. This is a shame, as I felt that while Cartus Rouge could have been nerfed, Cartus Rouge on a Cartus Curved Sword anyone, they should have increased the innate bleed of this weapon class. That said, nowadays people use basically two weapons of this class on invasions, the Dark Hand and the Cestus. The Dark Hand is a very good twink weapon for invasions up to soul level 30. It does really high damage at those levels, but because it cannot be buffed, infused or reinforced, its utility ends at around that level for PvP. The Cestus is another matter. Because of being a parrying tool in the offhand, its perseverance weapon art and easiness to use in almost any builds because of the low weight and low stat requirements, it's one of the most used weapons in the game. The perseverance weapon art basically gives you unlimited poise and lasts for about 4 seconds on the Cestus. Also, the damage you take is mitigated by about 50% during that time. There's a lot of stuff you can do with that perseverance weapon art. I don't use it a lot, so I don't have any invasion footage. Happily, my Drakeblood friend will help me. You can do perseverance, then swap to weapon maintaining the buff, perseverance into chugging, perseverance into backstab, etc. Straight swords are one of the strongest weapon classes for invasions, because they are the most flexible weapon class in the game. They are a kind of the Swiss Army knife of invasions. A big part of this flexibility has to do with the fact that nobody plays with straight swords two-handing them, as the moveset is so much worse than the one-handed moveset. This frees the offhand to use with shields, either for parrying or for the use of the weapon art, fists and claws weapons or even other weapons. In invasions as well as in dueling, the sword and board combo is immensely strong. You can pair the straight sword with a regular small shield such as the Wellen if you are going for parries more, or go for a medium shield such as the Lothric Knight Shield if you prefer to have more stability and 100% physical defense. Straight swords are strong against single opponents and multiple opponents, which is something that cannot be said for most weapon classes. Against multiple opponents, a straight sword turn and burn might be the strongest of them all, as the one-handed straight sword does a wide arc and the R1s are fast, allowing to catch multiple enemies and avoiding to overcommitting to engagements. They can also transition from offense into defensive into chase down mode in an instant, like no other class in the game, and have good running attacks as well as good roll catch potential, making straight swords a very good all-round weapon. The infamous R1-R1 R2 combo. This is the bread and butter combo of playing with the straight sword. This combo is not a true combo, but every straight sword user should know about it. After the first two R1s, the opponent usually rolls back to avoid continuing getting hit. The R2 catches that roll a lot of times. This combo is also good against parries, because the R2 will mess up the time for the face tank parry. That said, be careful of always doing this combo, as if your opponent becomes aware of you're spamming the combo, he will adjust its parry timing to parry the R2. The stance weapon art is the most common weapon art on straight swords, and it's one of the most flexible weapon arts in the game. Its weapon art R1 is useful for guard breaking, everything under great shield range and even some great shields, depending on their upgrade level. The weapon art R2 is very good at wake-ups, and it's also good for roll catches, and it has Hyperarmor. Straight swords are even useful on the offhand. This however comes at a big cost of not allowing you to parry or use its pokey R2. However, having the possibility of changing attack speeds can often confuse opponents. Fast weapons like daggers, curved swords and straight swords are somewhat difficult to parry if there is lag involved, and this will make you whiff a lot of parries, which is an advantage of these weapon classes. Nowadays I rely more and more in restart parries against these fast weapons. I would like to highlight 3 weapons. Lothric Knight Sword is one of the longest straight swords and it has an 110 critical modifier. It has a standard straight sword moveset except for its R2s, which are always pokes. It can be buffed and infused. However, it requires 12 strength and 18 dex to wield, which can lead to some stat spread. It has a stance weapon art. The Longsword. The Longsword is the workhorse of the straight swords. It has a similar AR and moveset to the Lothric Knight Sword, albeit with a 100 crit modifier and less length. It can be buffed and infused and has the very low stat requirements of 10 strength and 10 dex, which makes this a powerful weapon for all builds. It also has a stance weapon art. Gotthard's is the longest straight sword and it does a bit less damage than the Longsword or the Lothric Knight Sword. It has the infamous rolling L1 attack which does great damage and a highly damaging but slow L1 moveset. It has a very strong true combo of L1 into weapon art into R2 when two-handing it. This weapon is strong by itself, however you can make a build with items that increase the damage as long as you keep attacking, like the Old Wolf curved sword and the Pontiff left eye ring for even better results. Saint Riot plays a lot with sword and board builds. He sometimes goes for the R1 into R1 into R2 into jumping attack. It's a beautiful combo when it connects. Check this channel in the description. Curved swords are the kings of pressure in Dark Souls 3, and very likely the best roll-catch weapons in the game. They live by the motto, attack when the opponent rolls, roll when the opponent attacks, and should always be played by staying close to your opponent, and are, since launch, one of the most popular weapon choices for duelists. They also have really fast running attacks that don't have a lot of range. Curved swords are for me average to good invasion weapons. They can inflict tremendous pressure on one opponent, but lack the moveset to deal well with several opponents, and they don't have any burst damage abilities. They work best when two-handing the weapon, giving you more speed and range in your attack than the one-handed moveset. This means, however, that you cannot parry, mitigate damage, or use its weapon art, which in a lot of cases is not very good on curved swords anyway. I would like to highlight the following weapons. The Pontiff Knight Curved Sword. The Pontiff Knight Curved Sword has decent range and has not been affected by the nerfs to Cartus Curved Sword and Follower's Saber. Its weapon art is sometimes useful to punish opponents that are out of range for regular attacks. Oh, and if using the offhand it can also parry. The Follower's Saber. The Follower's Saber does good damage, has a nice range and a useful weapon art that is quite fast and covers more ground than you would expect. The R2 after the weapon art has Hyperarmor. The Sellsword Twin Blades. Sellsword Twin Blades play quite differently from the other curved swords, but can also put immense pressure on your opponents. They can do insane damage in the right build. The Sellswords have a true combo when two-handing them of L1 into weapon art into R2 that causes extremely high damage. Their main weakness is their lack of range, which forces you to be really aggressive. They are not very good against several opponents, requiring a lot of times for you to separate the opposing party into 1v1s in order to complete your combos. Demon Scar. The Demon Scar is a curved sword that also is a pyro catalyst. It has a pretty strong true combo of two-handed R1 into Black Flame. Ravan619 has recently posted a video about his pyro dueling build that you should check out if you are interested in this weapon and or dueling builds. Link to his channel in the description. On a final note, I hear that the Dark Infused Scimitar is also quite strong, but I haven't played with it yet. Katanas are versatile weapons. They have arguably the best running attack in the game, and thus are a great chase-down weapon. And they don't deal that badly with pressure themselves, as they are a relatively fast weapon class. Its typical weapon art, Hold, allows you to parry your opponent or unleash a fast strong attack with good range that is also good for roll catching. There's a combo that Katana users sometimes use, of R1 R1 into weapon art R1, that sometimes catches your opponent back roll. I like its one-handed moveset more than the two-handed moveset, as the two-handed R2 is hardly useful except for parry bait. Its one-handed R2s are a good long-range poke that I feel is sometimes useful. You can use a weapon art shield like the Eastern Iron Shield, which will give you access to the one-handed moveset, the weapon art, and will give you the possibility of mitigating damage. However, after all is said and done, I don't like invading with katanas as a main weapon all that much, as other weapon setups can do all the things katanas can, but better, like a sword and board combo, and have the ability of being inserted in several builds. This difficulty in using katanas in builds other than dex builds is a serious issue, as only 3 katanas can be infused, and of these 3, only the Uchigatana requires less than 16 dex to wield, which is still quite high. Pairing with katanas is also pretty difficult, as you must have a great deal of anticipation, as you need to sheath your weapon before attempting the parry. It makes face tank parries barely possible, or at least inconsistent with katanas, and set of parries impossible, as you won't have time between swings to block with a katana and then parry. I would like to highlight 3 weapons from the katana class. The Uchigatana, simply because it can be infused and played in builds other than the dex build. I made a pyro and used the Uchigatana, and it was one of the most fun experiences I had in Dark Souls. The Onikiri Nubadashi. Even though Onikiri Nubadashi cannot rely on Cartouche Rouge anymore to do immense damage, it's still a great weapon with a versatile moveset and great damage. The Oni Slayer weapon art is the only katana class attack to have Hyperarmor, and its L1 follow-up is a true combo if you manage to hit your opponent with the weapon art. The Chaos Blade. The Chaos Blade is the second longest katana, and the one that can potentially do more damage and has the highest innate bleed of all katanas. Every time you hit your opponent, you lose about 1% HP, but it's a small price to pay to use this great weapon. A short mention of the Frayed Blade. The Frayed Blade has the most original weapon art of the Katana class and can be very good for dueling invasions. However, the weapon art ends up consuming a lot of FP, and the weapon itself requires 40 dex to wield. So there's a lot of stat spread in attunement and dex already. My builds with this weapon always had to center around it. However, the payoff is not that great for invasions in my opinion. The Frayed Blade also has true combos such as the R1 into weapon art R2, but for me they have been inconsistent. Oh, and beware, the weapon art R1 can be parried. Saul Glacius, a YouTube uploader, has a lot of great katana videos. I left a link to his channel in the description. I rarely use thrusting swords when invading. They are very cherished in the dueling community, but for invading I think there are better options like straight swords that are more flexible and much better at dealing with multiple opponents, which is a big weakness of thrusting swords. That said, I mainly have used thrusting swords in two different ways. Firstly as a secondary weapon for chase downs and dealing killing blows. Thrusting swords running attacks are fast and have some range, although the tracking is quite weak. Also, thrusting swords have faster than you think rolling attacks. For this I usually choose the S-Stock because of its high damage and big range. Secondly, I have used the rapier in the offhand because it can parry, and most opponents don't know that. And secondly because, like all thrusting swords, they can be used defensively, a bit like a dagger, as its attacks are quite fast. Axes compete with straight swords for the same slot on most loadouts, as they have similar weights and functions. Axes have a little more damage than straight swords, especially if you account for the most common axe weapon art, which is Warcry, which gives, I believe, between 5 and 10% more AR. However, this weapon art negates the AR given by attack boosting spells and resins. Axes are, however, much less flexible than straight swords in almost all respects. Although they fare well one-handed, they don't have the one-handed straight sword swing arc that is so useful against multiple opponents, nor the very useful stance weapon art of most straight swords. Their running attack is also inferior, in my opinion, to the straight sword running attack. However, axes are very good at roll catching, which is something straight swords are also good, and very good for outspacing opponents, in which I believe they are better than straight swords, especially the long axes like the butcher's knife or the man's serpent hatchet, because each time you swing you advance quite a bit. This is for me the best trait of axes. I would like to highlight 3 weapons. The Dragon Slayer Axe. The Dragon Slayer Axe does incredible damage at low soul levels if raw infused, being an excellent low level invasion weapon. It benefits a lot from Lightning Blade at higher soul levels too. The Dragon Slayer Axe is used a lot by Fighter PL, also a Dark Souls uploader, link in the description. The Millwood Battle Axe. The Millwood Battle Axe, aside from the running Warcry, is notable by the absolutely insane AR it can reach on a strength build. At 66 strength, a heavy infused two-handed Millwood Battle Axe is pulling 541 AR at plus 10, even without the buff from the weapon art. This AR value is higher than the one achieved by some heavy infused plus 10 Greatswords. My favorite one, the Man's Serpent Hatchet. The Man's Serpent Hatchet has the biggest range of all axes and also can penetrate shields, which is useful as axes don't have a shield break ability like straight swords do. This weapon is used a lot by Stray Curtis, a Dark Souls uploader. Link to the channel in the description. Spears are seemingly simple weapons. They are long and they poke your opponent. That's it. However, I find them to be quite useful in invasions. Most of their moveset is very similar, and therefore most spears can be played similarly. Because most of their attacks do thrust damage, they benefit greatly from the Leo Ring. For me, they have the best running attacks in the game, as they are longer than most katanas. They are very useful against multiple opponents, if you can keep them at range. Their attacks have very fast recovery frames, so you can attack and quickly get out. They are very good pressure and chase down weapons, but deal very badly with pressure themselves. Once an opponent gets near you, you better roll out or have a fast close range weapon to switch to. It's important to be mindful that spears can easily be set up parried on the second swing. Therefore it is important to play unpredictable with spears as much as you can. A short mention of the Pikes subclass, as they are not very talked about in the community. There are only 3 Pikes in the game, the Pike, the Great Lance and the Lothric Knight Long Spear. Pikes are heavy spears that usually do more damage than regular spears, and they play a bit differently than a regular spear. Their running attack is very risky, as you become locked in the animation for a while, and tracking is very bad, so you tend to overshoot your opponents, leaving you open for retaliation. However, I feel that Pikes, at least the Lothric Knight Longspear, deal with pressure much better at short range, as their two-hand tracking is quite good, having been buffed a while ago. Other thing of note about spears is that a good amount of them have low minimum requirements. They can be buffed and infused and don't weight a lot. That means you can use them as a backup weapon, with all schools of magic, which makes them a very versatile weapon class. In this clip I'm using a dark infused winged spear on my pyro. Pikes are a different matter, as they have much higher stat requirements, which will lead to a bigger stat spread if not going for a quality, strength or dex build. I will highlight the following weapons from the spear and pike class. The winged spear. The winged spear is one of 3 spears with very similar movesets but different weapon arts that can be buffed and infused and need only low stat requirements, being usable in multiple builds. The other 2 being the partisan, which has a true combo of R2 into weapon art into R2 or R1 combo, and the regular spear. The winged spear for me fits very well the philosophy of how I see spears. It has the charged weapon art for increased pressure. Another good alternative might be the 4-pronged plow, which is one of the longest spears in the game, as well as having a disjointed hitbox, which means the weapon model is shorter than the actual hitbox. The 4-pronged plow has low stat requirements, but I cannot get over how bad it looks. However, that fall at the end of the weapon art is hilarious. Lothric Knight Longspear. The Lothric Knight Longspear has had its tracking buffed on the April patch with all their pike brothers, and now I use it more like a closer range spear that sometimes roll catches with the R2s, although this is very inconsistent. It has great tracking with the R1s at the expense of the bad running attack discussed before. This weapon also has an interesting property of increasing Poise by 10, and I quite like it as a backup to my Poise build. Oh, I almost only use it two-handed, as the one-handed pike moveset is quite slow. Ring Knight Spear. The Ring Knight Spear is for me the best spear and one of the best weapons in the game. This spear has the moveset of the partisan. Its R2s are wide swings, which are sometimes useful when dealing with multiple opponents or for roll catches. However, it's the devastating weapon art that makes this spear really good. The weapon art into R2 is a true combo, and the follow-up R2 punish panic rolls. The weapon art and the follow-up R2 have Hyperarmor, and if you connect the weapon art into R2, it can one-shot phantoms and sometimes hosts at meta level. The weapon art jump can be easily parried, so beware of using it out of neutral. However, it has amazing tracking, so you are rewarded by using the weapon art at offbeat timings. I would like to mention the poison-infused Rotten Grew Spear, as for me it's the best weapon for inflicting poison to an opponent. It procs poison in about 4 hits. Reapers are, in my opinion, one of the hardest weapon classes to use as an invader. There are only 4 Reapers in the game. Of those 4, I almost only see 2, the Great Corvian's Sight and Alfreda's Great Sight, and those are the ones that I have more experience with. Reapers lack a lot of tools to really be useful. They don't have Hyperarmor on their regular attacks, their swing speed is very slow for a non-Hyperarmor weapon, and they cannot do burst damage except for Alfreda's Great Sight weapon art into R1. And their one-handed and two-handed attacks are relatively easy to parry once you get used to the odd timing. Also, they have a sweet spot bonus damage, doing less damage if you hit your opponent with the shaft of the weapon. They are not good at applying pressure because of the slow R1s and average running attack range, and are not very good at dealing with pressure at very close range. They have some redeeming properties, however. They can chip through shields, but there are much better weapons and spells to deal with shields, and their rolling attacks come out faster than what I would expect, given the slowness of the class. Against multiple opponents, however, the flaws of the weapon are compounded, and winning invasion against 2 or more players becomes really hard if you are only relying on a Reaper. The fact is, Reapers only really shine at a very specific range and in specific conditions. That said, if you are being insanely passive, backpedal a lot and throw some staggered R1s, sights can in my opinion be really good, especially in the arena. A YouTube uploader called Dramatic shows in a video I linked in the description how to play with the Corvian Great Sight in duels. I will not take part in the discussion about the Corvian as a meta dueling weapon, but I think the video is worth watching. In invasions, however, 1v1 Reaper fights tend to reach an equilibrium. Even if you can outdamage the host, he has twice the Estus and 30% more health, so the fight's gonna be a long drawn out affair, where it is hard to finish the deal as sights lack pressure and burst damage options. This is relevant because in invasions the speed at which you kill the host is important. If you take too long, you increase the risk of phantoms friendly to the host being summoned. Now let's look at the Corvian Great Sight. The Great Corvian sight has some interesting properties. It has a disjointed hitbox, meaning that you can hit opponents further than the sight model. All Reapers R1 true combo into R2s, which is a good way to increase the damage. The R2s come out relatively fast, but their range is very small. The next swipe weapon art is the only attack on the Corvian that has Hyperarmor, but its hitbox is kinda wonky, and its damage is quite low. For higher damage you need to headshot your opponent with the next swipe, which is not easy to do. Frida's Great Sight is a very different weapon from the Corvian, and it has an even slower moveset. So much so that I use Frida's weapon art almost exclusively, more akin to a spell and then switch to another weapon, in this case a straight sword. Its one-handed attacks are so slow that you can use them as parry bait, as I know that probably my opponent will be able to roll through all my attacks. The Frida's Great Sight weapon art R1 is its greatest strength, as it does not consume FPs and can be spammed, being one of the biggest one-on-one newbie killers in the game, as it can cause immense amount of damage. You can do some mix-ups with it, stopping the attack and then reinitiating it, or even for wake-ups. Frida's Great Sight builds do well with 40 endurance and Ring of Favor, which increases the endurance even more for a longer duration of the weapon art. The weapon art R1 is pretty good against solo opponents, but not as much against several opponents, as you are stuck in the animation for quite some time. I was very lucky not to be damaged in this situation. The weapon art R2 is useful to zone an area or to allow for heals. This move is however somewhat slow and you risk retaliation, especially against several opponents. There are several ways to counter the weapon art R1. You can backstab the Frida's user if you time your rolls well and you are a bit lucky, or you can parry it, aim for the non-magic sight. However, these strategies are not very reliable. An ultra weapon R2 against the Frida's user if you don't have a lot of poise, or regular R1s if you do, usually do the trick. Whips are not seen often in invasions. There are only 5 whips in the game, and the Rose of Ariandel has a small club moveset and it's a miracle catalyst, so it doesn't really count as a whip. The other 4 are basically the physical whip, the bleed inflicting whip, the notched whip, the poison inflicting whip, spotted whip, and the pyro whip, the witch's locks. I only have experience with the witch's locks, but all of the whips have the same moveset and they can be very useful in invasions, if almost always in 1v1 scenarios. Whips cannot be parried and cannot riposte or backstab. All of the whips have the same weapon art called Impact, that goes around shields and affects the stamina regeneration of the opponents, except for the Witch's Locks, whose weapon art deals more damage, but without the stamina regeneration temporary debuff of the other whips. Whips, however, require a different way of playing when compared to all the other weapons in the game. Whips, R1s and R2 attacks are relatively slow, but their rolling counterparts are quite fast, and their range is massive. Therefore, they are very good counter-attack and roll-catch weapons. Evade and Punish are the bread and butter of playing the whip class, and the weapon art is a beast at roll-catching, also having amazing range. It can also be used in the face of the opponent for extra hits, so they are a tremendous defensive tool or against hyper-armor weapons. However, they lack pressure options, and so I would use other weapons for that while invading. Keep in mind that one downside of playing whips is that the weapon art is so good that I end up using a lot of FP, which is not a problem in a pyro build, but it can be a serious hindrance in physical builds. Whips can also be used in the offhand for roll catching or to mix things up. Although I would not recommend invade only using a whip, I think they can be very useful as an alternate weapon, and I have always used the Witch's Locks in all my invasion pyro builds. The YouTube uploader Utas made a video I really liked about whips, which I'll link in the description. Before we go on, I want to talk a little bit about Poise after patch 1.08. This is not a Poise guide, but I recommend you watch Big Hat Logan's somewhat old video that I linked in the description in order to understand the Poise mechanic in depth. Also, as I've stated before, I've linked in the description a Reddit post with Poise thresholds and a Poise calculator. The weapons we talked about thus far don't have hyper armor on the large majority of their attacks, though some weapon arts or specific attacks of those weapons have hyper armor. They are fast weapons that are not meant to win by trading with your opponents. The next weapons in this guide all benefit from stacking up Poise, and I will call them hyper armor weapons. I mention this because the way you play with the following weapons discussed in this guide will be heavily affected by your understanding of Poise and how you design your build. Of course, you don't need Poise to play with these weapons. I play with these weapons in medium and light Poise builds all the time in order not to invest a lot in vitality or to carry more weapons. However, understanding Poise will help you understand what you can and cannot do with these weapons. So, what is Poise? Poise is the ability to keep swinging your weapon when also being hit by a weapon, trading, during your Poise frames. If your Poise is high enough, through equipping heavy armor or using certain items and weapons, you will never get staggered out of your attack animation. Before we go into an example, let me tell you that different attacks from the same weapons have different Poise damage values, but I usually just look at the R1 two-handed value thresholds, which is what is more used in PvP. Also, Poise suffers from diminishing returns, and so the more Poise you stack, the less you will receive. So getting above a given threshold will make your whole build at the meta level of 125 likely to center around Poise. This is because, as a rule of thumb, the heavier the armor, the more Poise it has, so you have to have a lot of vitality. Ethel's Ring, Ring of Favor and the Prisoner's Chain all help with the equip weight, to avoid having to a lot of stat points in vitality. Also, please note that there are some items that directly increase Poise: the Wolf Ring, the Lothric Knight Long Spear and the Yarm's Great Shield. Without getting into the mechanics of Poise, and at the risk of oversimplifying the Poise mechanic, let's see a simple example of how to Poise through an opponent's attack, with the help of the calculator referenced above. In this build, I have a Poise of 41.88. The calculator tells me that I need 37.58 Poise for one trade, against a Greatsword, which is what my opponent is using. I can swing a second time before being interrupted. My opponent gets staggered immediately by my swing. I now know that he has under 37.58 Poise, given that we both attacked with weapons whose two-handed R1s do the same Poise damage. However, by trading the first time, I also took Poise damage, and my Poise health that was previously at 100% will drop. In my second swing, my Poise health will go back to 80%, no matter how low it was from my opponent's swing. The game then checks if I can Poise through the second attack at 80% Poise health. The calculator tells me that I need a little over 50 Poise to keep swinging indefinitely against other Greatswords at 80% Poise health. Because I have less than that, I will stagger. I still chose to trade, albeit getting staggered, because he had less HP than me and he would die in one hit and I would not. Please also note that you can reset your Poise to the maximum level, 100%, by not getting hit for 30 seconds, by using some weapon arts, or your invisible Poise health bar reaching 0, because of damage taken, although you won't know when this happens. As a rule of thumb, the heavier the weapon class you are using is, the lower your Poise needs to be for you to keep swinging against other weapons. For example, if you are using Lido's Great Hammer, you will be able to Poise through all of your opponent's Greatsword two-handed R1s with just 22.14 Poise. Compare that to the 50 Poise needed not to be interrupted in the before mentioned example. I think knowing about Poise is very useful, as knowing about what you can Poise through or not can make the difference about winning or losing an invasion. In the example shown, I felt confident while looking at his armor that I could outpoise the White Phantom, at least for the first hit, and so I chose to trade. If I was the White Phantom, I would have avoided trading at all costs, and would have probably swapped for a slower or faster weapon to counter me, or would put my efforts into outspacing my opponent. I like to invade with Halberds. They have good range and the best running attack of all Hyperarmor weapons, except for curved Greatswords. Its running attack is also good for roll catches. Like Reapers, they have a sweet spot mechanic if you hit your opponent with the blade part of the weapon, but the damage difference is less harsh than with Reapers. They can deal good pressure, but don't deal very well with it. A move I often use with Halberds to relieve pressure other than changing to another weapon is the back roll attack, which comes out relatively fast. Against skilled opponents, I use the reach of the Halberd for staggered R1s, as the second R1, which is a wide sweep, is very punishable with backstabs. However, against less skilled multiple opponents, the second R1 is valuable, as you can hit several people as it makes a wide arc. All jumping attacks are a high risk maneuver, but with Halberds I end up using them more often than with any other weapon class. This is because the jumping attack on some Halberds has a weird timing that has a somewhat wide range and can sometimes roll catch. Its one-handed moveset is quite slower than the two-handed moveset. However, that slowness can be used as bait for parries, as you will have a hard time hitting opponents with the one-handed moveset. All Halberds, except for the Halberd and the red-headed Halberd, which have a different moveset from all the other Halberds more akin to spears, have Hyperarmor on their two-handed R1s. They don't have a lot of Hyperarmor though, as you need 37.15 Poise to infinitely Poise through all the two-handed R1s of non-Hyperarmor weapons. This 37.15 Poise burden is significantly lowered to 18.30 if you fight against a one-handed non-Hyperarmor weapon such as one-handed straight swords. Halberds will have a hard time fighting against anything more poise heavy than them, needing a whopping 64.81 poise to indefinitely poise to two-handed R1s from hammers and 66.16 to poise to two-handed greatswords. There are two halberds that I feel are head and shoulders above the rest, being borderline overpowered: the split-leaf greatsword and the crucifix of the Mad King. Split-leaf greatsword, the worst named weapon on the game, has several things going for it. Firstly, it can have an extraordinarily high damage for a halberd if heavy infused. At 66 strength, it has an AR of 599 that can be buffed. This also means its criticals are very strong. I have done more than 1300 damage under a boast. However, the strongest thing going for it is the weapon art. I use the weapon art in two ways. As an aggressive tool like this, using the R1 into weapon art into R1 and R1, which can deal over 1000 damage. By the way, the R2 in the weapon art can also be useful for attacking people that are further away, but this is a risky move, and I almost never do it. But the best use of the weapon art for me is as a poise shield. It turns out that you can outpoise almost all Hyperarmor weapons in the game with the split-leaf weapon art. Windwheel, the split-leaf weapon art, only needs 25.57 poise to go through the first two-handed R1 of a great axe or an ultra great sword. This allows you to hit the weapon art like a parry, poise through the R1, and then do the weapon art R1 into R1 for over 1000 damage. This is also a true combo. The following R1 can also roll catch like in this example. There's a video by Angeluso about the split leaf that you should see if you are interested in the weapon and its combo mix-ups. Link in the description. The Crucifix of the Mad King. The Crucifix is a weird weapon for several reasons. It has much more Hyperarmor than all the other halberds. Instead of needing 37.15 poise to go through two-handed non-Hyperarmor weapons, it needs only 7.26, which means that poise-wise the Crucifix has the same poise values as a Greatsword, which has much more Hyperarmor than all the other halberds. However, its poise can be bumped even further with its weapon art, if you use it like a parry, making you able to poise through ultra great swords and great axes at just 30.53 poise. For comparison's sake, an armor halberd will need 71.62 poise to two-hand R1 indefinitely through an ultra great sword. The Crucifix's R2s are arguably the best in the game, as it has the R2 moveset of the Great Club, making roll catching opponents very easy. However, of course you won't have the poise of a great hammer. The weapon art can be followed by a heavy attack that will trigger one of three effects at random: Perseverance, Vexation, in which an orb will follow you exploding and doing AoE damage, and a Roar, which will throw your opponent to the ground. You can capitalize on this last effect with a Hunter Charm. Builds with this weapon benefit greatly from stacking poise, and the Crucifix damage will greatly scale with the Dark Blade buff and a good deal of Fate investment. It has several true combos as far as I can tell. The weapon art seems to true combo into another weapon art. The two-handed R2 combos into an R1, like a Great Club. It also seems that the weapon art does not combo into the following R2, but there are very few frames in between to escape. For the longest time I felt hammers were kinda useless, except for the ones with Perseverance. They don't have a lot of range, and I would rather use an axe or a straight sword instead of them. It's one of those classes that really improves once you understand poise. They have Hyperarmor on their two-hand R1s, two-handed R2s and jump attacks. In truth, they are non-Hyperarmor killers if you go above 28.36 poise. This means you can infinitely Hyperarmor to all the non-Hyperarmor weapons. Against halberds, you will need a great deal of poise to indefinitely poise through them, but that number is still achievable at 47.22 poise. Against other weapons with Hyperarmor, the hammer class utility diminishes quite a bit, as they don't have a lot of range, fast attacks or really good damage. They have that kind of delayed swings axes also have that in certain situations will allow you to hit your opponent 3 times. Hammers can also be used to roll catch with consistency. I would like to highlight 4 weapons. The Mace. What really makes this weapon stand out from the others is its Perseverance weapon art. With that, you can basically poise through anything in the game. It reaches 500 AR unbuffed on a 66 strength build. It does strike damage, like most hammers, which is useful against most heavy armors. Warpick. The Warpick benefits from the Leo Ring, as all its attacks do thrust damage. The weapon art Galvanize is useful because it noticeably increases stamina regen, which makes it easy to run through a level to find a host or just to keep the pressure on him. The Hazel Pick. The Hazel pick also does thrust damage, which is good for Leo ring counters, and it's also a sorcery catalyst. It has a one-hand or two-hand R1 true combo with Old Moonlight or with Soul Greatsword. Drang Hammers. The Drang Hammers are a bit like the Sellsword Twin Blades. They are slower than the Twin Blades, have more reach, and have a boatload of combos. They can L1 into Weapon Art into R2, they can R1 into Weapon Art into R1 or R2. In the right build, not that dissimilar from the Sellsword Twin Blades build, they can do a lot of damage. Greatswords are slow methodical weapons. The running attack is quite bad and they have a hard time pressuring opponents. However, they deal very well with pressure, as the two-handed R1 swing is quite fast and its hyperarmor starts very quickly, making it hard for a non-hyperarmored player to fight against a good greatsword user, especially without a shield. Good greatsword players tend to stagger their R1s and always walk forward in order to pressure their opponents and take advantage of the greatsword weapon length, and also to avoid being backstabbed after the second R1. There are two types of greatswords two-handed R1 movesets: the moveset of the Hollow Slayer and the Drakeblood Greatsword, the Blender moveset, and the moveset of all other greatswords, the normal moveset. The Blender moveset has a chain of 3 two-handed R1s versus the normal moveset, which has only 2 before restarting the animation. The Blender moveset has faster hyperarmor startup frames than the normal moveset and gets progressively faster hyperarmor startup frames from the first R1 until the third R1 of its chain. Also, the Blender moveset spends progressively less stamina from the first R1 per swing until the third, and the normal moveset spends an almost flat amount of stamina through swings. The Blender moveset seems to me to have better tracking, maybe because it's swinging more times, than the normal moveset. However, a big advantage of the normal moveset versus the Blender moveset for me is its increased range and forward momentum. All of this is relevant because I see these two movesets in different ways. For me, the Blender moveset plays better at very close range and against several opponents, but applies less pressure. It's a bit more defensive option. The normal moveset with its forward momentum and range can be played more aggressively, but deals a little bit worse with pressure itself. Back to the Greatsword as a class. A lot of them have weapon arts that have Poise heavy abilities, such as Stomp, Stance, R2, Perseverance, making it possible for a Greatsword user to punch above their weight poise-wise. Greatswords can poise with their two-handed R1s indefinitely through non-hyperarmor two-handed R1 weapons at 7.26 poise. Halberds are 31.67 poise, through hammers at 48.07 poise, and through other greatswords at 50.07 poise, for which you will need a very dedicated build at soul level 125. Their one-handed moveset does not have hyperarmor, but it's very useful because of the huge arc it makes, making it easy to hit multiple opponents. It's also a fast swing, just a little bit slower than the straight sword swing. Using the Greatsword one-handed also allows for damage mitigation with a shield and the possibility of parrying. The Greatsword class has a huge amount of variety, having weapons for almost all builds. The Moonlight Greatsword for sorcery builds, the Onyx Blade for pyro builds, and the Wolnir's Holy Sword or Drakeblood Greatsword for fate builds. These are just examples. Oh, and since nowadays a lot of players are using set of parries, the Greatsword user needs to be careful not to spam R1s when against a shielded opponent. A lot of players are using curved greatswords over regular greatswords nowadays, because while they weight a bit more and have slower swings, they have higher damage, more poise, and a much better running attack. I will highlight 3 greatswords. The Black Knight Greatsword. The Black Knight Greatsword has 560 AR on a 40-40 build, which is quite high for a greatsword. However, this weapon's utility in invasion revolves around the weapon art Perseverance, making it an ultra-great weapon killer. Press that weapon art button and you become a Poise god. It's a bit of a one-trick pony though, and against more experienced opponents they will let your Perseverance buff run out or find another counter to you. The Claymore. The Claymore is for me the best simple greatsword in the game. It requires relatively low stats, it can be infused, making it good for a variety of builds. It has good length and a pokey moveset, useful for Leo ring counters, on its R2s and two-handed rolling R1s. In a 66 strength build, it will get 554 AR if heavy infused, which is quite good. Its weapon art is Stance, which is very useful, especially the R2 that does very good damage, has a good amount of hyper armor, and because of the additional length of great swords relatively to straight swords, it is for me an even better tool. Gael's Greatsword, the anime Greatsword. It has more length than it seems because of the sword's eroded model. It does strike damage, which is very rare in Greatswords, and it's useful against most heavy armor opponents. It also has a pokey moveset, which is useful because of the range it can hit and Leo counters. It is, however, its weapon art that really makes this sword stand out. It has a guaranteed R1 into weapon art into R1 that easily does 800 damage. However, I sometimes just go for the weapon art into R1 just to make things up, as the attack comes out fast and the R1 after the weapon art has some hyper armor. Notice, however, that the R1 after the weapon art is parryable, so feel out your opponent to know if he will go for parries. Curved Greatswords might very well be the best standalone hyper-armor weapon for invasions. They are heavier poise-wise than Greatswords, needing only 42.73 poise to indefinitely poise through them. Also, unlike Greatswords, both the one-handed or two-handed R1s have hyper-armor, which leaves the offhand to use as a parry tool or to mitigate damage. The running attack is the best of any hyper-armor weapons, and thus curved Greatswords are very good at pressuring opponents. They also have an R1 into jumping R2 true combo that is useful if you want a bit more damage at the cost of a significantly high more stamina cost. Their AR can be very high, entering well into ultra territory. A sharp Murakumo at 70 dex can have an AR of about 600 unbuffed, and a 66 strength Exile Greatsword can go up to 658 AR, also unbuffed. However, curved Greatswords one-handed and two-handed R1s are relatively slow, giving you ample time to roll back and avoid their swings if you do not panic roll. Also, curved Greatswords are very easily parried. This has a lot to do with the aggressive playstyle of a typical curved Greatsword user that uses a lot of running attacks and follow-up R1s. A good curved Greatsword user can then go for backstabs or their weapon arts, which are all unparryable, but this will make the fight less straightforward to them. There are only 5 curved Greatswords in the game, and I will highlight only 2. Only the Old Wolf curved sword can play a different role, and does less damage for it, as it can also be used for its buff 2 damage and HP regen for continuous attack hits that stack with the Pontiff side rings, that is useful for paired weapons setups, like the Sellsword Twin Blades. I think it also still has a true combo of R1 into L2 into R2, but I'm not sure, as I haven't used it recently. The Murakumo. The Murakumo is basically the Dex Exile curved sword. It does a bit less damage, but it's much longer, and its range, because of the curved nature of the weapon, is deceptive. Its main use of the weapon art for me is to avoid being parried, as the R1 into weapon art into R2 true combo is not there anymore. The Exile Greatsword. The Exile Greatsword is a strength curved greatsword, and it's also the highest damaging. It has quite less range than the Murakumo and the same moveset. If you are interested in curved greatsword gameplay, I recommend the channels of Skitter the Tryhard and I Am Amish. They play a lot with curved greatsword, especially the Murakumo. Links in the description. We are now getting into big boy territory. Ultra weapons are very reliant on poise and trading to do damage, as its movesets are pretty slow. In order to hit people more consistently, I sometimes go for 2 baits in order to force opponents to roll in order to roll catch them. The L1 wiggle and the resin bait. Ultra weapons are useful against several players, as sometimes they try to swarm an invader. Usually I always have a faster backup weapon like a straight sword, a spear or a thrusting sword to finish opponents, as ultra great weapons running attacks are very bad and use a lot of stamina, which is important if you are pursuing an opponent. Ultra great swords have quite a varied moveset for ultra weapons, and they have big range, which is useful when attacking several players. They are divided into the ones that have a two-handed R1 horizontal moveset, like the Lothric Knight, Lorien's or Astora's Greatsword, and a vertical moveset, like the Greatsword, the Fume or the Cathedral Knight. Both one-handed and two-handed R1s have hyper armor. Ultra Greatswords need 45.82 poise to poise indefinitely through two-handed R1s from curved swords, and 35.39 to poise indefinitely to Greatswords. I prefer the vertical swing ultras because I feel they are more useful against skilled opponents. Also, with vertical ultra greatswords you can also have the horizontal swing one-handed that is useful against multiple opponents and still maintain poise, and also being able to parry. On the other hand, two-handed horizontal ultras always have the horizontal moveset even if you one-handed. I also prefer ultra greatswords that have the two-handed R2 poke, because of its range and Leo ring counter damage potential like Astora or Lorien's. I would like to highlight 4 weapons. The Historic Greatsword. The Historic Greatsword is an excellent weapon, especially for dex builds. It has an S scaling on dex and only requires 16 strength. It's buffable and infusible, so you can use it in magic builds, and it weighs less than most greatswords, allowing you to have Ultra Poise and Greatsword weight, which is amazing. It's very long and its moveset is very good, allowing for pokes with the 1- and 2-handed R2s. Although its charged weapon art is very easy to parry, it is very good for finishing opponents, being the only ultra weapon in the game with this ability. The Greatsword. I really like this weapon and I have used it a lot. It's the longest Ultra Greatsword except for the Fume. The R2s one-handed or two-handed can be very useful as they surprise a lot of people. It's both buffable and infusible, and does class-leading damage on a strength or on a dark build. I really like the Stomp Twist weapon art, as it's the hardest stomp weapon art to punish, and can hit several opponents. Its second two-handed R1 combos into another R1, which I don't think is a norm on Ultra Greatswords. Its one-handed moveset is also very useful against multiple opponents, as the blade is so big it can hit multiple adversaries. The only downsides for this weapon is the very high weight, the non-existent R2 poke, and the rolling attack, which is the same as Great Hammers, and so it's very slow. The Fume. I think the Fume is a bit of a misunderstood weapon. Its weight is very high, and the damage is not amazing for its tremendous weight. And its stamina consumption is over the top, yes. However, the Fume is a great hammer poise-wise, and with a much better moveset than most Great Hammers. This means that with 38.87 poise, you can infinitely poise through everything in the game except for Great Hammers, where you can poise through one hit, while having good range and quite a good moveset. Oh, and the Fume is also buffable. The Ring Knight paired Greatswords, aka the meme swords. I hate this weapon for a variety of reasons, but it's very good at invasions. L1, L1, L1 will win you a lot of them, as it has a very good tracking on that L1 even after a quite imperceptible nerf. You can do a lot of mix-ups with its L1 and weapon art, and there are a lot of shockwaves and stuns in a lot of animations. Oh, and it also has the poise of a Great Hammer. Great Axes for me might be the worst class in the game. Their poise is the same as Ultra Greatswords, but with a much less diverse moveset, which is always a 1- or 2-handed vertical slam, except for the Black Knight Great Axe that has a much more varied moveset. They weight quite a bit, and there are no options for lighter Great Axes, like a Starter Greatsword on Ultra Greatswords or the Great Wooden Hammer on Great Hammers. I very rarely use them in invasions, because I prefer the more versatile moveset of Ultra Greatswords. Great Axe AR tends to be a little bit higher than Ultra Greatswords, but for me the trade-off to a worse moveset is not worth it. The Yorm's Great Machete. The only Great Axe I have used extensively in Invasion is Yorm's. Yorm's has amazing length, and it's really hard to outspace. However, its first R1 does not combo into second R1, except if you interrupt an opponent or if you roll catch, then sometimes it will combo. I don't know if this is intentional or not. The Great Machete also has the same issue. However, if you use Yorm's or Great Machete on the offhand, your R1s will combo into another R1, so you can have a straight sword on the main hand and Yorm's on the offhand. If you go for a 66 strength build, this can cause a lot of damage. The downside for this build is that you cannot parry or mitigate damage as long as Yorm's is out. Other more normal way of using Yorm's is in the main hand, with a parry tool on the offhand. Bait your opponents with an R1 and then parry them. The Black Knight Great Axe. The Black Knight Great Axe trades the range and the vertical swing of most Great Axes for a bit of a more varied moveset. A short range two-handed R1 and a one-handed R1 that makes a wide arc around the player, and probably has the highest stun time of any weapon in the game. If Great Axes tend to have two-handed vertical swings, Great Hammers tend to have two-handed horizontal swings, except for the Pickaxe that has vertical swings. Even more than the other Ultras, they are meant for trading with your opponents, as Great Hammers can poise through other weapons with the less poise in the game. There is a subset of Great Hammers, which I call the Ultra Great Hammers, that need even less poise to go through other weapons, although the difference is not very big. They are Lidos, Morns and Smos. For a Great Hammer to poise through a Great Sword indefinitely, you need 27.11 poise, 38.87 poise to poise through a curved Greatsword and Ultra Greatswords and Great Axes, and 45.86 to go through a Great Hammer indefinitely. Like Great Axes, however, you have some low weight alternatives to insert in your build in order to become a poise god. The Great Wooden Hammer only weighs 6 units and has a true combo of R1 into weapon art into R1. Another low weight option is the pickaxe, that only weighs 8 units and everyone tries to parry it, although like all ultra great weapons, its two-handed R1s are unparryable. All great hammers have a true combo of R1 into jumping attack if you need to squeeze some more damage at the expense of a chunk of stamina. I would like to highlight some weapons. The Great Club. Unsurprisingly, the best great hammers are the ones that have movesets that allow for mix-ups. The Great Club is one of the best. It weighs very little at 12 units and it has an AR of 641 at 66 strength. It can be buffed and infused, so you can use it on other builds. Its R2s are arguably the best R2s in the game, having enormous range and a big roll catch potential, while dealing very good damage and having a lot of poise. Also, a Great Club R2 will true combo into an R1. Spiked Mace and Greatwood Hammer. The special thing about these weapons is the very damaging combo of R1 into weapon art into R1. You can also just go for the weapon art into R1 if you feel you cannot hit people with the first R1. Lidos. Although it's the heaviest weapon in the game, Lidos has immense poise and deals a lot of damage. Its mix-up potential appears in the form of its weapon art, Call to Stone. It comes out quickly and covers quite a bit of ground. Also, Call to Stone has tremendous amount of Hyperarmor, allowing you to tank a Great Hammer two-hand R1 with just 29.68 poise. Crossbows are excellent offhand weapons. For me, they are particularly good at lower levels because a lot of low-level players tend to invest less points on vigor and the bolts always deal the same damage irrespective of level. Plus, crossbows don't scale with stats, only with upgrades. However, they can be useful at all levels. Use exploding bolts for higher damage and AoE potential, however you will be able to carry less of them. I basically have used two crossbows, Evelyn, which has a great damage potential but spends a shit ton of bolts and wastes a lot of your stamina, and the Arbalest. I use them in several ways. To keep medium range pressure on a party, if I don't have or I don't want to use a great bow. For duels, if your opponent isn't shielded, you basically backpedal, take melee pot shots with your weapon and punish their whiffs with the crossbow. I also use them at point blank range. Opposing players don't usually expect getting shot in the face. I also use them to pursue opponents, as crossbows pair well with the chase down weapon. Save your ammo, especially with the Evelyn. Use lightning bolts for harassing at a distance and exploding bolts when there is a high probability of hitting your opponent. Great bows are auxiliary tools for an invader, and I play with them all in the same manner. The only one that stands out is the Millwood Great Bow, as its weapon art allows you to create an AoE explosion that sends people flying. Great bows are the best tool to make opposing players run through a level instead of ganking you at the bonfire. Slap on an obscuring ring and go for headshots. If you're going for a quality build, the Dragon Slayer might be the best option. If you have a Dex build, go for the Oni Slayer. If you are using a strength build, go for the Millwood. This logic, however, gets skewed because of the way two-handing works in the game, when it comes to the strength stat. So in reality, almost everyone will go for the Millwood, as you only will need 19 strength and 12 dex to two-hand it. Well guys, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope this video was useful for some of you and beneficial to your invader game. See you guys next time.